So hello everybody, welcome to our afternoon of honoring Zvi Gittelman. We have a pretty full afternoon planned for you all. We'll begin with a panel that we're doing right now at 3 o'clock. And this is a panel of former students and colleagues and other professors who have worked with Zvi over many years. And they'll be talking for a little bit, and then we're going to have a small break, and then Zvi will be giving a talk at 5 o'clock, and then we'll be inviting you all to a reception afterwards. And I'll have a lot more to say about Zvi when I introduce him at 5 o'clock. So not that much, but a little bit more. I see Zvi nodding along, but a little bit more to say about Zvi at that point. But I thought at this point we'll begin with our panel discussion, again, of 3 scholars. And the first one, we'll have each of them come up. They'll each be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes about their own work and how, a little bit, they'll talk about how their own work fits in with the contributions that Professor Gittelman has made over the 49 years that he's been teaching here at the University of Michigan. And he was active a few years before that as well. So a long and illustrious career Zvi's had here. I don't know if I introduced myself yet. I haven't, yeah. That's always, first thing in my notes, but then by the time I get to that. So I'm Jeffrey Weidlinger. I'm the director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Michigan. And again, I welcome all of you here for our afternoon of intellectual enrichment. So our first speaker for this panel is Anna Shternshis. Anna Shternshis, we're doing it in the order on the panel here. Anna Shternshis is the Al and Malka Green Associate Professor of Yiddish and Diaspora Studies at the University of Toronto, where she also directs the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. She's the author of numerous articles on Soviet Jewry and several books. Of those books, I'll mention in particular her first one, Soviet and Kosher, Jewish Popular Culture in the Soviet Union, 1922 to 1939. And most recently, just in the last few months, it came out, a really fantastic book called When Sonia Met Boris, An Oral History of Jewish Life Under Stalin. And this afternoon, Anya will be speaking about Orphans and Abandoned Babies, Soviet Yiddish Songs about World War II. So please join me in welcoming Anna Shternshis.
Thank you. Hi. It is a great honor and pleasure to be here back at the University of Michigan and to participate in this event. When Jeff called me on the phone to invite me to do this a few months ago, it took me about 5 seconds to answer, to make the decision to come here. The only thing I did is that I looked at my calendar and said, oh yeah, that's the last day of classes, the very last class that I teach at the University of Toronto. So definitely, I'm canceling all that and I'm coming here. It took me another 5 seconds to write the whole paper in mind for this event, because Jeff said it's an honor of Zvi's scholarship. So I thought, okay, I have a paper and I could tell you on the phone exactly what I'm going to say. I thought that I would start by telling you stories about how Zvi was my undergraduate professor in Moscow in 1991, and how he was teaching this course on Soviet Jewish history and culture. And it was very cold, and the Soviet Union just collapsed, so there was not much heat there in that room. And it felt very special to be learning about early Soviet Union with all this process of transforming Jews into Soviet citizens and all this. So Zvi mentioned it in his class. He said, there is this rumor going that there was this document created in the 1920s when the former yeshiva students and the rabbis got really involved with the Soviet regime, really excited by ideas, and wrote so-called Red Haggadah, where in that book they were fighting against all these rituals of Passover and trying to convince Russian Jews to become Soviet citizens. She said, I've never seen it, but maybe if one of you ever finds it in the library, that would be interesting. I think I remember he said he'll give you $10 for it, but I can't guarantee that. Anyway, to fast forward that a little bit further, I think 3 or 4 years later, I was in that library, and I found a Red Haggadah, and it was not called Red Haggadah, it was called the Young Communist League Haggadah for believers and atheists, for Gläubers und Apikorsim. And I photocopied, I sent it to Tzvi, but what it got me is a lot more than $10. It got me a book, Soviet and Kosher. It got me another book, a career in working on Soviet Jewish history. And that was just the beginning of my talk. Then I wanted to tell you about how I worked with Tzvi on an oral history project and how he introduced me actually to the oral history method and how we talked about how to use those testimonies. And that's, I don't know if you'll believe me, but I'm telling the truth. You know how everyone is now talking about digital humanities, and I don't know how many of you associate Tzvi Gilman with digital humanities, but I have to report, right? I have to report that as early as 1999, Tzvi and I were working on digital humanities, and this is a program called NVivo. Do you remember that? A program that helps you understand how to analyze texts. And we spent, I would say, 3 or 4 years working on using that program, trying to make sense of oral histories of Soviet Jews. Tzvi hired a lot of graduate students to help us with this. It took us about 3 to 4 years to realize that this program is absolutely useless. But it's called this pioneering work. Anyway, then I thought I would report that one of the most exciting things that I do right now is bringing art and scholarship together and thinking about how we write history going beyond the textual media and bringing art to that. And I want to report that Tzvi too was one of the first people, actually the first person who encouraged me in thinking that direction. And that is when in 1996, when there was a defense of all graduates of the Russian State University of Humanities, students who had to present their research projects, their long research papers, for the audience of, I don't know, very serious scholars and kind of, it was called defense. I was writing about Soviet Yiddish songs, and Tzvi said she should sing some during the defense. And David Fishman, who was running that program, said, sure, she should sing. But they were Americans working in Russia. And all the people in charge, the dean and the rector and all this, they were saying, how could that be? Defense and talking about academia, this is serious business. That we cannot have singing there. And they said, no, you can have singing. And I went and sang a song, a Yiddish song about Stalin. And that too. So anyway, so I had all this paper in mind, and then I spoke to Tzvi about a month ago, and he said to me, don't even think about this. Don't do anecdotes. Do a real paper. So I can't say no to Tzvi, and he knows that secret, and I'm going to share with you. You know how we all write for a reader in mind, and we'll think, who's that reader going to be? I've always been writing for Tzvi, and I always write, when I write something, I say, I wonder what Tzvi will say, and then I cross it out. Because he told you that story too, I'm sure, about his investment in this red ink pen. Anyway, so today's paper is a short version. Don't worry, I know, I'm looking at the time as well. But today's paper is inspired by Tzvi's work, and it is with Tzvi as a listener in mind, and whatever he doesn't like, I also know, but I'm going to say it anyway, because this is just how it works. So I'm going to start by, I told you there's going to be a little music, I hope. I'm going to start by playing to you a fragment of a song first recorded in 1945 from a 10-year-old girl named Valia Reutlander in Tulchin, a town in Ukraine in 1945. You can read the English and and Russian translation of it, but hold on a second. This song, you know how I told you I used to sing and the thing? So the singer who sings on that record is my son, Isaac Rosenberg. So I used to sing, now my kid sings for my presentation. This song tells a too familiar story of many Jewish and non-Jewish children during World War II, the story of young kids in the Soviet Union losing their families. Ever since the Red Army began entering Ukraine in 1943, they encountered many children who managed to survive the war away from their families, some in hiding, some with partisans, some in unknown circumstances. At the end of the war, there was an estimate there was about 1 million orphans living in the Soviet Union. Of course, kids of all ethnicities and all nationalities. The largest number of these orphans survived the war in the Soviet era. For example, among 1 million people who ended up in Uzbekistan during the war, 200,000 were children. And of them, about 16,000 lived in orphanages in 1942 and 31,000 in 1945. Not all these children lost both of their parents. Sometimes they just lost one parent and the other parent was unable to care for them. Or maybe they just lost them and they didn't know where they were and they ended up in those orphanages. It is hard to know the number of Jewish children among these orphans. Einikite, Soviet Jewish Weekly, reported at some point in 1945 that there were 900 Jewish orphans who they were able to identify that survived the war in Kazakhstan. Then, in 1945, and we follow that story from Einikite as well from this weekly, the Soviet press reports that they got a donation from Jewish organizations in the United States to build state-of-the-art orphanages for orphanage for Jewish children in the Soviet Union. So they chose to do this in a province called Birobidzhan, a far east region of Russia, of the Soviet Union, where there was a Jewish autonomous region. So they said the problem is they need to find Jewish orphans to send there. So they made a call to orphanages, to these children's homes, as they used to call them in Russian, in Kazakhstan and also in some areas of Siberia to find Yiddish-speaking children who could be dispatched to this orphanage in Birobidzhan. And teachers were able to identify about 100 Jewish children. None of these children admitted that they spoke Yiddish, and not a single one of them was sent to Birobidzhan. But children who grew up in orphanages, or even mass scale of these orphanages in the Soviet Union, were not caused, of course, by the war alone. In 1937, the time between 1937 and 1939 is known as the period of great terror in Soviet history, when a lot of people were arrested and sent to Soviet prison for political and or alleged political crimes. And one of the consequences of that is there were a lot of children who were growing up in Soviet orphanages. When the war began, it's not that their parents were suddenly released from jail. Those children already lost these parents before the war. But what happened in 1937-38, nobody's talking about those orphans. Arrests happened, there are a lot of children in the state care, but nobody's discussing that. Not only that, in the 20s, the Soviet culture and Soviet ideology is not upset about orphans at all. In fact, there is a lot of pedagogical literature that comes out in the Soviet Union that says, it's not so great for kids to be raised by parents. Parents have all this conservative influence, they're backwards, they don't really believe in the revolution, they teach their kids to be religious. You know, we have parents, fine, let them be with parents, but it's better if kids grow up in communes. And there were a lot of Soviet pedagogical minds who were seriously advocating for this kind of upbringing. Makarenko, Sukhomlinsky, many names, big pedagogues were writing books about this. So although this practice was not really adopted in the Soviet Union starting from as early as mid-20s, the discussion of orphans as a bad thing was not really in a part of a public discourse. That changes almost overnight when the war begins. When World War II begins, suddenly the biggest victims of the war are the children who lost their parents. Orphans are the symbol of destruction, the symbol of devastation and despair. Children who lose their parents, they end up in the news, and the whole country follows those news, trying to reunite children with their parents. And, there was this film made in Uzbekistan in 1943 called You're Not an Orphan. It tells a story, actually a true life story, of a man who, it was a film made by Shukran Abbazov, who tells a story of a man who adopted 14 children who lost their parents during the war. But what's interesting about this film is that they praise the man who adopted children as opposed to the man who sent those kids to orphanages. So now we see the change of the ideology, because now we're talking about the family as the best thing for children as opposed to the state care. Now, today, we know so little about how Jewish children actually, any children, but especially Jewish children, how they lived through the war. We have some lists, we have some numbers, although not enough, but really not enough sources trying to understand what it was like for a Jewish kid, especially an orphan, to survive World War II. In the past 10 to 20 years, we see an outburst of testimonies. So those children who survived the war in the Soviet Union lived to see the time when their stories became interesting and relevant. And they started sharing those stories, sometimes with Shoah Foundation, sometimes with other collectors of these stories, sometimes professionals, sometimes they just write their memoirs down and self-publish them. And then we see hundreds, if not thousands, of these testimonies showing up. But the problem is, of course, they're recording the experiences that happened a very long time ago, and there's a lot of work has been done, especially in the field of Holocaust studies, that tell us that studying those testimonies, especially by people who lived through an experience like that when they were children, is very problematic. For example, there's a British scholar, Rebecca Ilfrich, who compared how children, she studied Jewish children who survived the war in France and what she looked at is the testimonies recorded from those kids who just lived to see the end of the world in 1946, and then those the same people were interviewed again in the 1990s. So she was comparing those two sets of interviews and also reading the notes by teachers and psychiatrists that worked with those kids. So what she found was that in 1946, kids gave very detailed testimonies of what happened to them during the war, where they ran, how they survived, who helped them, who didn't, and all this. Teachers wrote very detailed notes about how you help children to speak about their trauma, how you make sure that they don't have those nightmares at night, but instead talk through this experience. So we have tons of literature on that. And then those people are interviewed in the 90s, sometimes later, and they universally say one thing: nobody ever talked to us about the war. Nobody ever mentioned to us, we are told to forget. And she says, but look, there are notes. You said, and the teacher wrote, no, we did not talk about the war. So the memory here tells a very different story from history. So she says, well, that's because those psychiatrists and teachers were really good at their job. And they told kids how to live through what they lived through, make peace with that, and continue. They didn't want these children to live with the trauma. They wanted them to forget. And that's exactly what happened. Those children were able to live the normal life. Which is all very interesting, but it doesn't help us understanding how to use those testimonies recorded today in the 1990s. It's not that we have stories of Soviet Jewish kids and I recorded in 1946. What do we do with them? So one of the things that I suggested, that what I was thinking of doing is, and I got lucky that I was able to do this, is to look at the materials produced during the time of the war or right after the war and see what we have about Soviet Jewish kids then. And one of the things that I was able to find in the Ukrainian National Library are the collection of songs that were recorded by Yiddish ethnomusicologists between 1941 in 1947 from Jews who either survived the war in Ukraine or more likely survived the war in the Soviet era. And among them, there were children as well. And those children were singing these songs. One of them was the one that you just heard earlier. What are they singing about? What do they care about? Why do they sing what they sing? And these sources are not the testimonies, they're not stories of what happened to these children, but they are sources that tell us how these children who sang these songs, how they made sense of the experience, and how they used those songs to do what they did. One of the things that I found out is that I think a lot of these songs were used as begging songs. So those kids who left without parents, they have to go around and they have to sing and beg for bread or for something for others to help them. What are they going to sing about? They're going to sing about how they're orphans and nobody will take care of them. And then they will also sing about how there is no hope. And these materials from these are the people who collected them, this stuff, and this is how the notes look, just like, to give you a sense of that. They're writing all that down. They're just writing all these songs. But then the scholars who are collecting these songs, they're thinking, we have to publish it somehow. And if we have to publish them, we have to change them so that they fit into the Soviet narrative. So what do? The children say, there is no hope, nobody will ever come and get us. Yeshua, salvation, will never come. They cross it out at the bottom, you see, and say, soon there will be an end to our suffering and we will be saved. That's it. What happens as a result? A child who sings that song as a begging song, and it comes as a grassroots culture, is transformed into a motivation piece for a Red Army soldier, for someone to fight, because you're suddenly fighting for a child and you give hope to that child. So using the documents from the time, I know I'm mindful of the time that I have, using the documents from the time is not as straightforward as it might seem, because they are dealing with the different constraints, and these are constraints of Soviet censorship and Soviet scholarship. But the combination of things, of the songs, that, by the way, none of the people who I interviewed, some of the people that Jeff Weidinger interviewed remember, but most of the people who I interviewed for my work, about 474 people to be exact, of that generation, none of them remembered singing anything in Yiddish during the war. Before the war, for sure. After the war, yes, but not during the war. So that's the piece that did not end up in their memory. But looking at these pieces that did ended up in that archive gives us a sense of how children understood what was going on with them, and also what scholars did in order to preserve these materials for us. So I'm going to just conclude by thinking out loud about what can we learn from songs, not as literary scholars, not as folklorists, but as historians. I think that in addition to, and you can read the other fragment from a song recorded as well, I think that in addition to providing us with a taste of the time, these songs demonstrate, together with other sources, that we can talk about the specific victim narrative of Soviet Jews that emerges during the war. In Yiddish, these songs work out the language to commemorate the dead and also to remember them. So they start to come up with things that will work, such as orphaned children, and that, of course, speaks to orphaned parents. For Jewish parents, the chance of losing their children was a lot higher than for non-Jewish parents. Just like for Jewish men, the chance of losing their parents, their elderly parents, was a lot higher than for non-Jewish soldiers, because only 1% of Jews that survived, that stayed in German-occupied Ukraine, survived the war. So that works out the strategy of how you talk about this and what you say and how you remember. But it also gives language to non-Yiddish speaking, Russian speaking Jews who later take some of the elements of that and they create the narrative of commemorating the war and Jews during the war without naming Jews as Jews. So peaceful Soviet citizen, orphan children, those become the code words for remembering the war in a climate where remembering Jews was difficult. So as with any memory, this one is selected. It does not tell the stories of mothers abandoning their children, and it doesn't tell the story of young victims. But in absence of other sources from the time, the songs actually provide us a glimpse into daily life of Jewish children during the darkest chapter of Jewish history in Europe, living for something that no child should ever experience or learn. And the fact that they sang for it all needs to get our most devoted attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And next time we'll try to get you to sing for the next retirement that we do for Tzvi. Our next speaker is David Fishman. Professor Fishman is professor of modern Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's also the director of Project Judaica, a project that has been involved in bringing Jewish education to students in the former Soviet Union. Professor Shternshis is one of those who benefited from Project Judaica. He's the author of many books. I'll name a few. Some of them include Russia's First Modern Jews, The Jews of Shklov, The Rise of Modern Yiddish Culture, and most recently, and this is really most recently, just came out a couple of weeks ago, and in fact he was just speaking about it last night over at Congregation Beth Israel. If any of you were there, it was a wonderful talk on the book smugglers, partisans, poets, and the race to save Jewish treasures from the Nazis. And we'll be going from a talk on children to a talk on rabbis. The title of his talk is Rabbis Against the Revolution on Conservative Jewish Politics in Late Imperial Russia. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Fishman.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm really happy to be here. I've been thinking all day how happy I am that I happen to be here to share this occasion with Tzvi and with all of us. I'll say only a little bit about Tzvi. Those were my instructions, only a little bit. I first met Tzvi in, I think it's 1984 or 5. I was finishing my dissertation, and I was a very shy graduate student. And I wrote, maybe because of that, on a very obscure topic, the Jews of a town called Shklov in Belarusia. I think it was important, but it sure sounded obscure. And I read, of course, Tzvi's first book, still a great book, Jewish Nationality in Soviet Politics, which was an eye-opener for me. So basically, Tzvi and Ezra Mendelsohn, these are like gods to me. You know, I was in awe of them. I'd never met him yet, but, you know, it was a small field, and there were these two great books and two great scholars. And then I bump into this man in the old YIVO library. I'm scared. And he says, you wrote a dissertation about Shklov. That's fantastic. And he's the only person who ever said that to me. And that simple act of kindness, and maybe, I think Tzvi also knew something about the history of the Jews of Shklov to appreciate that it actually was an important topic. But that simple act of kindness, you know, has remained with me. And that was the beginning of a friendship and a collegial relationship. I just want to say one thing to the people here from UMI. You are losing Tzvi. We are gaining Tzvi. What I mean by that is he won't be going to committee meetings. He won't be teaching the students. You will feel the sense of loss. But now Tzvi will be full-time writing and researching. And I expect, you know, a lot of productivity and a lot of... so the field gains by your retirement. Let me tell you the project I've been working on and off for many years, building pieces of it. It's about, I call it Rabbis and Revolutionaries in Russian Jewry, so a lot of R's there, between the 1880s and the 1920s. These two extremes on the Jewish political and cultural spectrum. That is, the rabbis, the most conservative, small c. These are all Orthodox rabbis. Culturally very conservative, politically you'll see very conservative. And the Jewish revolutionaries or radicals, the Bundists, on the secularists on the other end of the spectrum. And the relations between them as they change over a 40-year period of time. It's mainly about clashes and confrontations, but there are borrowings, there are influences both directions between the radicals and the rabbis. There are moments of conciliation and attempts at mutual understanding. So it's a rich topic, and it's a topic really about parents and children, meaning many of the parent generation come from this traditional orthodoxy, and many of the children's generation come from, are now involved in radicalism. It is the flip side of things Tzvi wrote in his first book. In other words, Tzvi wrote about radical politics, Jewish politics in Tsarist Russia, about the Bund. He wrote about the Yevsektia, the Jewish communists' anti-religious campaign. Tzvi is the first to write about how radicals viewed religion. And I wanted to do also the flip side. Well, how did the religious view the radicals, the revolutionaries? The Bund, for those of you who don't know much about this field, was founded in 1897. By the early 1900s, it's a very politicized movement, meaning it's engaged in anti-governmental demonstrations, anti-state literature, at least one assassination attempt on a government official, armed self-defense against pogromists, and connected with that against the police, because many times the pogromists and police are on the same side. So what I wanted to see was, how do rabbis react to this political agitation by the Bund? And I want to at least start by saying there was a very wide range of possible reactions rabbis could have to this. I do want to stress there is a strain of radicalism in the Jewish tradition that could have been mined, right? There were Jewish rebellions against the Greeks. We're about to celebrate, Jews are about to celebrate the Hanukkah, which is about a rebellion against the Greeks. There were Jewish rebellions against Rome, the Roman Empire, which is called the kingdom of evil in rabbinic terminology. There is the exodus from Egypt, which can be seen as a kind of insurrection or rebellion against slavery. All of these are themes of a kind of radical moments in the Jewish political experience that could have been mined by rabbis if they so wanted, but they don't. And in fact, those moments in Jewish history are mined by the Bundists. The Bundists will refer to the Exodus and freeing ourselves from slavery. Or socialist Zionists will use the same kind of, they will refer to the Maccabees as, the predecessors to the French Revolution. But rabbis don't go that way, at least in the period I'm talking about today, which is up until 1905, the 1890s till 1905. Now, there are two types of rabbis, really. There are those that are politically silent and politically passive, and basically say, I don't do politics. I deal only with strictly religious affairs. And some very great rabbis from the turn of the 20th century, we have no idea what their political opinions were, whether they liked the Tsar, disliked the Tsar, because they just don't address it. But those who do address it overwhelmingly have a conservative political bent. That is, they justify or support, those are slightly different things, either support or justify the existing political order and regime. And I've got a typology here. I'll give you 3 ways and degrees to which they do that. The simplest way is simply to say political obedience is a religious obligation. And there's I'm going to spare lots of names and details today, but we have those rabbis who simply say, I'm quoting from a code of Jewish law, from a great authority at the turn of the 20th century, Chil Michael Epstein, who simply says, we are obligated to be submissive to the king and lovingly fulfill his commands. And he quotes verses, he quotes Talmudic statements. Now, this is basically kind of submissiveness to the state as required, whatever its laws may be. The law of the land is supreme. Even one rabbi says, we must support a parliamentary system in the Austrian Empire because they have a parliamentary system. But we must support autocracy in the Russian Empire because they have an autocratic system. In other words, whatever the system is of the state, we are obligated to follow it and to be submissive towards it. Now, sometimes this can spill into a second category I'm going to get into, which is the second category is a kind of rabbinic monarchism. That is a full-fledged embrace that monarchy and Tsarism are the preferred political system. It is good for people and it is good for the Jews to have a monarchy. Some of those rabbis will say, basically quote verses, basically with the idea of the divine right of kings. Kings are not coincidental. They are divinely anointed, divinely appointed, and quote verses to the effect that just as you follow God, just as you obey God, you must obey the king because the two are interrelated. The king comes from God. One of my authors, a rabbinic monarchist, has a whole, actually some interesting arguments besides verses. One of them is constitutional and parliamentary systems are inefficient. If there's a crisis, a war, a famine, an epidemic, parliamentary systems are slow to react. You got to have meetings. You have to convene parliament. Autocracy is the quick way to govern because crises can be dealt with quickly. But then he goes on, and this is the more relevant question for us. He says, autocracy is better for Jews because the great danger for the Jews is popular anti-Semitism. The masses, or anti-Semitic movements that rise up from the masses. But it's the king or the monarch or the czar who can put a cap on popular hatred of Jews, who can prevent outbursts of anti-Jewish violence. They say, look at the Dreyfus affair in France. There you have a constitutional and parliamentary system, and you can see, because they're free, you can have this kind of anti-Semitic uproar. Look at the Austrian parliament, where there are so many anti-Semitic deputies. The Tsar protects us from the masses who could basically run amok if they were given that possibility. We need autocracy. The other argument, which is striking for this rabbinic monarchist, is the restrictions that the Tsar puts on Jewish rights in Russia are good, at least for Judaism, maybe not for the Jews, but for Judaism. The Pale of Settlement, which restricts where Jews could live. The quotas on Jews entering the universities, the numerus clausus. These are good things because Jews will remain compact among themselves. They will remain separate from the Gentiles. They will not enter higher education in the modern professions. They will remain religious. So a czarist system that restricts Jewish rights is good for the Jewish religion. That's the second category. You have these rabbinic, really ideological monarchists. The third category I would call simply pragmatic quietists. And their idea is quite simple. Jews are weak. Jews are vulnerable. Because of that, Jews should refrain from political activity altogether. Because whenever Jews get involved in politics, they become a target by others. So the Rabbi of Minsk writes, how can we Jews who are compared by the prophet Isaiah to a little worm, how can we meddle in such things as politics? Consider well, this isn't a public proclamation, consider well, Jewish children, what you are doing. it's always a call to the youth, because it's the youth and the children that are doing these radical acts. Do not endanger the happiness of our people, the happiness of yourselves, and that of your parents and families. In other words, you will harm our people, you will harm yourselves and your families, and the best thing a Jew can do is stay out of politics altogether, which basically means accept the system as it is now. Those are my three groups. And rabbis overwhelmingly, when they speak on politics, speak either one, two, or all three of these languages about politics. This even becomes sharper after the pogrom in Kishinev in 1903. The pogrom in Kishinev in 1903, a big traumatic event that radicalizes most of Russian Jewry, either into Zionism or into socialism. But the rabbis have a very peculiar take on Kishinev. Kishinev was the act of local people in Kishinev, local insiders. The authorities in St. Petersburg, the Tsar and his ministers, are not to blame for the pogrom in Kishinev. Most modern intellectuals said exactly the opposite than the rabbis. The authorities in Kishinev want to protect the authorities in St. Petersburg, in the capital, want to protect the Jews. In fact, the greatest danger to the Jews are the radicals themselves, the Bundes and their activities. That is antagonizing the regime against the Jews, right? The regime feels threatened because of Jewish radicalism. And the greatest exponent of that idea, that it is the Bundes who are endangering the Jewish people, is the Lubavitcher Rebbe of that time, Shalom Duber Schneerson, who writes in a letter, there is no possibility to intercede with the authorities on behalf of the Jewish people at this time. At this time, when the young people, our young people, the Jewish young people, are engaging in deeds that they must not do, without a doubt, they, the young people engaging in these terrible deeds, they are the reason why the government is not taking care of us. Well, once you've got that perspective, that it is the Jewish radicals themselves who endanger the Jewish people, you have polarized the situation entirely. And that's why you get responses that can vary from, I'll give basically two responses. One is these kind of demonstrative acts of patriotism to the Tsar and to the Tsarist system by rabbis. They can be public proclamations, we love the Tsar. The Rabbi of Grodno issues such a proclamation, sort of fawning obsequiously over the Tsar. They can be sort of these demonstrative receptions for the governor general of the province. You know, the governor general comes to town, and we have these descriptions. He is received by the rabbi, the community elders. They issue him bread and salt, these traditional gifts. They issue him a Torah scroll as a gift. And then they go to the synagogue where the cantor and the choir sing Bozhech Tsariach Rani, God Save the Tsar, the national anthem of Imperial Russia. In other words, imagine the cantor and his choir in the synagogue singing the anthem in front of, for the Tsar. That's one kind of reaction, demonstrative patriotism. And the other reaction is even more extreme, which is to actively, to call on people to inform on youngsters who are engaging in radical political activity. And we have several rabbis that call in public proclamations to parents, if you see young people doing this stuff, please report it either to the police or to me, to the rabbi. And we even have reports, and I haven't fully confirmed them, of rabbis actually doing that. The most famous case is the rabbi of Lodz, or Łódź, in the Kingdom of Poland, then under Russian rule, where the rabbi reportedly, first of all, hired young Hasidim to infiltrate Bundes groups and serve as moles in Bundes groups and then be able to inform who they were to the police. And another report that the rabbi himself talked to the police how to detect who is a socialist demonstrator. You have a big street demonstration, and the question is, who's a demonstrator and who's a pedestrian? Police shouldn't arrest apolitical Jewish pedestrians. And the rabbi reportedly told the police, it's very simple. If the person is wearing tzitzis, these fringes that Jews wear, he's not a socialist demonstrator. Don't arrest him if he's wearing tzitzis. If the woman is wearing earrings and an apron, she is not a demonstrator. Don't arrest. But this is the police giving instructions so that your run-of-the-mill Jew will not get arrested and only socialists will get arrested. And one of my rabbinic sources writes, it is, if a person is obstinate in his opposition to the monarch, the law, the halakha, the religious law is, he should be handed over to the government so that it do to him as it pleases. So you can have demonstrative patriotism, you can have actually active cooperation with the police authorities. So in this period, at least up till 1905, the rabbis were the most politically loyal segment of the Jewish population in Tsarist Russia. You could be counted on them. The regime could count on rabbis and those fervently following rabbis to be in their camp. You start to get fissures after the Russian Revolution of 1905. I'm not going to go into that. But I want to stress that this posture, I believe, cost the rabbis in terms of public opinion in the Jewish community. In other words, their position is a shrinking position, and many Jews believe that rabbis are discredited by defending the Tsar and the Tsarist system, and declaring this kind of patriotism to it. And this stance by the rabbis probably hastened the rise of a kind of strident secularism and a militant secularism in the Jewish community in Russia. In other words, they stuck to their guns, an unpopular position, but their public support shrunk and shriveled up as a result of that. And you get a strengthening of radical trends that Zvi has written about in his work. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fishman. I guess the rabbi should have had somebody crossing out their messages and writing in something new like they did for... it actually reminds me of the story of back in Tsarist times when the Tsar would be mentioned, the police were there, and everybody would start chanting, "Hurrah, hurrah!" which in Hebrew means he is evil, but can be taken for hooray. Our final speaker for this panel is Professor Todd Endelman. Professor Endelman is William Haber Professor of Modern Jewish History Emeritus right here at the University of Michigan, and was a former director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies for many years, and was very instrumental, along with Zvi, in establishing the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies. He is the author of numerous books, including The Jews of Georgian England, 1714 to 1830, The Jews of Britain, 1656 to 2000, Broadening Jewish History Toward a Social History of Ordinary Jews, and most recently, Leaving the Jewish Fold, Conversion and Radical Assimilation in Modern Jewish History. And the title of his talk today is Fighting Antisemitism with Numbers. So please join me in welcoming Professor Todd Endelman.
I first came across Zvi Gittelman's work in the early 1970s when I was a graduate student. A small group of us had a reading group, and we read his book on the Jewish section of the Bolshevik Party. And my impression after reading the book, one impression was that he was a historian and not a social scientist. I've since learned, after having worked with Zvi here for over 30 years, really, is that in fact he is an outspoken advocate of the places that social science should occupy in the study of contemporary Jewry. he is in that sense, a social scientist par excellence. And I want to celebrate his retirement by offering a small contribution to the history of Jewish social science, that is, the use of social science techniques in illuminating Jewish history. And I'm going to draw on material that I have come across during my current project, which I'll talk about in a second. It's a biography of a man named Redcliffe Nathan Salomon. I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. When Jews began to imagine their entry into European state and society, mainstream society, that is from the 18th century on, they had to work out a way to respond to anti-Semitism, or specifically anti-Jewish charges. And in the West, the most common strategy, as I say in the West, I mean Central Europe, Western Europe, and North America, the most common strategy up until really after the Second World War was to attempt to rebut slanders, to correct misinformations, to set straight all kinds of distortions and falsehoods. The idea was that if one provided the correct information regarding the Jews' occupations, the Jews' demography, the Jews' loyalties, the Jews' contributions, the Jewish health, whatever, that this somehow would set the record straight and would be a sufficient way to combat anti-Semitism. Now, there were two assumptions underlying this technique, and I said this was the dominant technique for over 200 years. In some places, it still is the accepted way of doing it. And these two assumptions are rooted in the Enlightenment philosophy of the 18th century and in liberalism of the 19th century, classical liberalism. The first assumption is that anti-Semitism is a product of ignorance and prejudice. That is, it's the absence of truth, that people who are anti-Semitic or prejudiced in general are that way because they've simply never been given the truth, that they've been fed all kinds of distorted materials, and that this can be countered by providing an alternative narrative, one that sets forth the truth. The second assumption that underlies this strategy is the notion that human beings are rational creatures, that they can, I heard some laughs when I said that. I don't know if it's the age of Trump that's producing those laughs or whether simply a knowledge of Jewish history. Anyways, that human beings are rational creatures, that they can judge between what is true and what is false when given the correct information. Now, these assumptions underwrote most Jewish defense efforts in the West, attempts to fight anti-Semitism, between the French Revolution and the years after World War II. Missing from these assumptions was any kind of influence of a psychoanalytic understanding of human behavior, that is, the notion that emotional needs and indeed unconscious needs may be motivating people, nor did it derive any kind of insights from a knowledge of the history of the Jews in 20th century Europe, in particular the horrors of the Holocaust. From the end of the 19th century on, quantitative research, data, statistical data, became much more important in this kind of defense material. It was partly because of the Jewish social science was emerging at this time in Central and Eastern Europe, primarily in Central Europe, and statistics themselves were coming to play a more and more important role in understandings of social science. The numbers then, and to a certain extent today, still are associated with objectivity, with universality, with neutrality, with clarity. They're in order, they're precise, etc. And all of these things lead us to privilege numbers and statistical evidence. The first Jewish social scientist, he didn't call himself a social scientist, I'm using the term today as to what he did. He made a living in other kinds of ways, and he was also a folklorist and historian as well. Actually was an Australian Jew named Joseph Jacobs, who was educated at Cambridge and in Germany and lived the first part of his career in England. And in the 1880s, he published a series of articles in the Jewish Chronicle, which were the first serious statistical efforts to understand the position of Jews in the modern world. He looked at matters like marriage rates, age at marriage, occupational structure, longevity, these kinds of questions. The problem was he left most of this work off in 1900 when he moved from London to New York and he became an editor at the Jewish Encyclopedia. And he didn't raise up another generation of Jewish social scientists in Britain. There was much more interest in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe, where Jewish social science flourished, really. Now, I should also point out that for Jacobs and for all the other pioneers of modern Jewish social science, the fight against anti-Semitism was only one motive driving their work. They were really addressing questions about Jewish identity and about the nature of the Jewish collectivity and the place of the Jews in the modern world. And in this way, they were contributing to an ongoing and often rather nasty debate that's generally known as the debate over the Jewish question. How did Jews fit in to modern societies while remaining Jews, or if they could remain Jews? So they were engaged in this larger debate, but the debate over the Jewish question oftentimes lapsed into simple anti-Semitism. Now, one of the few Anglo-Jewish scientists, and I mean in this case natural scientists, to champion statistical research as a way of fighting anti-Semitism was a late Victorian physician by the name of Redcliffe Nathan Salomon. And I'm writing a biography of him. He was an interesting character in many, many ways. And I'm today just going to deal with this part about his belief in the ability of numbers to fight anti-Semitism. He was well educated. He went to an English public school, then to Cambridge, and he trained as a physician in London. He was independently wealthy and essentially retired from medical practice because of illness and lived as a country gentleman outside Cambridge for his entire life. He was a Zionist, and he's probably best known, at least to the historical world, as a breeder of blight-free potatoes, which is very critical of the history of Britain and Ireland, and for a book he wrote called The History and Social Influence of the Potato. It was, you're laughing, but it's not funny. In fact, it's one of the most unfunny books, unlight books that I've ever read. He published it in 1949, and it's never been out of print. It's a classic of European social history, and I wish many of us would be in the position of saying 60 or 70 years from now, our books have never been out of print. In any case, I won't talk about his relationship between racial science, the history of potatoes, these kinds of things. What I do want to stress is he was interested in Jewish health, Jewish hereditary, Jewish demographics, because he believed that Jewishness was a bond that transcended mere beliefs and practices. In other words, in his view, Jews were a race, a collectivity that was bound together by biological ties. Precisely what he meant by that I won't go into. And this, in part, was this commitment to this notion of Jews as being more than simply a religious group. And that was not an uncommon view at the time, obviously. In part of this, he became a dominant figure in a social agency in London called the Jewish Health Organization of Great Britain. It was established in 1923 by Jewish medical men. And their main concern was the health of the Jews in the East End of London, meaning among the immigrant population and the children of the immigrants. They were concerned with the health of the Jewish race, and they believed that the health was suffering, and that there were things that could be done to improve that health. So they saw it as a nationalist and racial kind of measure. And what they did was, and in this they were quite progressive and advanced, they encouraged all kinds of preventive medicine. They gave lectures in the East End telling people how to raise their children. They published booklets, both in Yiddish and in English, telling people to keep their houses clean, to get rid of how to get rid of bugs, not to strike their children, not to use corporal punishment, etc. And in addition to these preventive health measures, the Jewish Health Organization of Great Britain also promoted research on the physical development of contemporary Jewry. This was an issue in the Jewish question, meaning the health of contemporary Jewry, which meant things like Jewish intelligence, Jewish demographic patterns, Jewish proneness or resistance to certain diseases. And the first time they got involved in a statistical intervention in contemporary affairs was in the mid-1920s when a report appeared alleging that Jewish children in the East End were less intelligent than other children in London, and that therefore Jewish immigration into Britain should not be encouraged. There wasn't much immigration by that point in any case. But it was motivated by, this investigation was motivated by a concern about Jewish immigration that had taken place earlier. So what the Jewish Health Organization of Great Britain did was to find someone to do research showing the exact opposite. And they hired a research scientist from the University of London, from University College London, who found just the opposite, that Jewish children were smarter in London than others, and that they didn't suffer from mental defects, and that they won disproportionate numbers of scholarships to went to Jewish children at age 10 and a half. Now, this was the kind of work they did. And I said they were founded in 1923. The 20s and 30s were years of intense anti-Semitism in Britain, as they were in the United States, and of course as they were on the continent, most everywhere. And this was the background to their involvement. In the mid-1930s, they felt the need for their kind of statistical involvement became even more important because of the rise of Nazism. And the rise of Nazism in Germany was accompanied by, or I can't say matched by, but accompanied by, a rise in British fascism. There was a group headed by Sir Oswald Mosley, known as the British Union of Fascists, sometimes known as the Black Shirts from what they wore. And they carried out various kinds of propaganda campaigns, but also they did provocative marches through the East End of London, which inevitably ended in violence directed at Jews and also then directed at them by Jews. And Salomon and the Jewish Health Organization of Great Britain called for a massive, credible defense of the community in statistical terms. And in 1933, he and the organization campaigned for the community to establish a communal standing statistical bureau whose purpose would be to gather information, statistical information, true information about Jews that could counter the rising anti-Semitic threat. To give you an idea of what they were about, one of their conferences took place in 1932, in November 32, at the communal center of London Jewry, Woburn House. The chair of the meeting was Sir Philip Hartog, an educationalist, and what he said essentially was Anglo Jewry never knew where the next threat was going to come from, and while he hoped that events in Germany were not an augury of what would happen in Britain, nonetheless he thought the community had to take precautions beforehand. And then he gave an example of a falsehood that was in circulation that he thought Jewish statistical research, numbers, would be able to counter. That was the claim that there were 500,000 Jews in London, because anti-Semites always exaggerated the number of Jews because they want to portray the fact that there's a possibility of a Jewish takeover or swamping. there were only probably 200,000, maybe a few more than that, not certainly 500,000. Interestingly, at the conference, and I say this somewhat aside, one of the rabbis in the group made a suggestion that maybe they could use a statistical data for community planning. In other words, if Jews are moving to one area of London, maybe that's where we should build institutions and not in another area where the population is diminishing. But that was really a sidebar. That was not a major issue at the time. Now, this effort to create a standing statistical bureau, to which Salomon was very committed, went nowhere. Absolutely nothing happened in terms of setting it up. And the reasons I'm having to hypothesize, the reasons were, first of all, that communal agencies which would have been expected to fund it, the Board of Deputies, the Office of the Chief Rabbi, the B'nai B'rith, these different groups had other priorities. And the other priorities from 1933, from January 1933 on, were German Jewish refugees who were flowing into London and needed to be cared for. And the British Jewish community had given an assurance to the government that they would support refugees who came. And the British government was much more accepting of Jewish refugees from Germany and then later Austria and Czechoslovakia than the American government was. On a per capita basis, they took far more. And this swamped the community. So they felt they had to deal with that first. The other reason is that there is a long-standing tradition of skepticism or scorn for intellectuals in Anglo Jewry. I sometimes have talked about a tradition of intellectual poverty in Anglo Jewry. And the idea of funding research really was foreign to Anglo Jewry. The idea of giving money to specialists, to intellectuals, to statisticians to do this kind of work was not something that enjoyed widespread support. Excuse me. Now, meanwhile, the Bureau has failed, but the level of anti-Semitism is creating even more havoc in the community. There's a big debate about how to best counter it through direct action, counter demonstrations, violence. And what happens is the Chief Defense Agency, the Board of Deputies, becomes concerned that a lot of hot-headed young radicals in the East End of London, working class, of immigrant background, will begin to take the initiative away from them. Many of them are connected to the Communist Party. So they want to defer that, so they said that we better do something more. So they began to pour more money into defense activities, but they're not willing to support any kind of ongoing communal organization. But it's a kind of counter-offer. They offer Salomon, well, here's £500, which actually was a considerable amount of money at the time, to conduct a research project on the percentage of Jews in all the professions. Because a common anti-Jewish charge at the time was that Jews dominated medicine or whatever the profession was. And the Jewish Health Organization carried this out. And they looked at the percentage of Jews in medicine, dentistry, law, architecture, surveying, the civil service, and teaching and research in England, Wales, and Scotland. And they completed their work in February 1937. Unfortunately, I have not yet able to find the report, and I'm wondering whether it even survives. But it so happens I'm also going to be in London next week, and I hope to trace it down, or try to. What does survive is an internal memorandum about the report from the Board of Deputies, which is tantalizing as to its contents. Now, it said, this internal memorandum, that these data would be useful and helpful in responding to charges in the press, but it also suggested another use for it. And that is, they suggested the data that they had found would be helpful in counseling young Jews to avoid going into certain professions where there was already large numbers of Jews. And the example, this is the only example that I found in this memorandum, was that in Manchester there were 761 doctors, and 108 of these were Jews. So obviously Jews in the Manchester area should not go into medicine. The assumption behind this was that it's real facts on the ground that create anti-Semitism, but that's another story altogether. But the report also pointed out that statistics, quantitative evidence, numbers, can be a double-edged sword when used in defense activities. And this memorandum pointed out that in certain occupational areas, they should not publish the percentage of Jews not because there are too many Jews, but because there are not enough Jews. And as they said, they reveal the weak points in our armor. And again, they only give one example, but it's tantalizing. They pointed out the number of Jews in the Territorial Army, which was the voluntary reserve branch of the British Army. Now, this was an army of 123,000, and the survey only turned up 13 Jewish officers and 42 Jews in other ranks, which, if my math is right, comes out to less than 0.04%. Not 0.4% or 4%, but 0.04%. So there was this concern. And in one sense, they were right. That is to say, they had evidence, and they talk about it, where the Nazis used in Germany in their propaganda material which had been published by Jewish social scientists. And they mentioned one specific example. There was a social scientist named Heinrich Silberglatt, who had been the head of the statistical office of the city of Berlin from 1906 to 1923. He had retired a decade before the Nazis came to power. And he was one of the pioneers of Jewish social science research in Germany. But the Nazis used material from his publications on Jews to pointing out that Jews were too dominant or whatever. And so they were concerned, and they had some right to be concerned about it. World War II brought an end to any more speculation about establishing any kind of organization to carry on Jewish research of this kind. The Jewish Health Organization of Great Britain collapsed during the war for, again, various reasons, many of them having nothing to do with the war, and it was never revived. And when Anglo-Jewry again turned to social science research and an interest in demography, etc., it was entirely for internal communal needs. And this was from the 50s on. It was after the war. And what's interesting is, though, the decline in the use of quantitative evidence, of numbers, to fight anti-Semitism doesn't seem to have come about in any way because there was ever any kind of systematic thinking about the assumptions that undergirded it. There was no fundamental reassessment. It just fell out of use. And in some places it's continued. But generally it's not used that much anymore. You might say, given the shortcomings of this kind of work, statistical research, numbers in the service of Jewish defense, is there any takeaway at all, except to say that these people had erred? And it seems to me the only takeaway is the wisdom of what is known as the strategic offensive principle of war. The best defense is a good offense. And that seems to me pretty good advice, certainly in the age of Trump. So, thank you.
Now I'll ask the panelists to come up and we'll have a bit of a discussion among ourselves.
You want to sit? Okay.
All right, so I thought we'll open things up for discussion in a little bit, but first I thought I would ask a general question of our panelists to reflect on the title of what this panel has been reflecting on, A Century of Ambivalence, Politics and the Jews, which of course comes from the title of one of Zvi's books, A Century of Ambivalence. On that note, by the way, I'll say when we were discussing what to call this whole day, I was thinking maybe we could call it, name it after one of Zvi's books. But then I thought A Century of Ambivalence, maybe that's not really appropriate as a title for a retirement conference. And then I thought of his other book, A Bitter Legacy. Also not so great. So anyway, are left with what we've got. So we called this panel, The Century of Ambivalence, Politics, and the Jews. But anyway, thinking on that topic, I thought I would ask each of the panelists to just briefly, before we open things up for general discussion, to reflect on maybe how the field of Jewish history or Jewish politics or whatever they want to talk about has changed in the 49 years that Tzvi's been teaching here. Maybe I'll just say 50 years for the sake of simplicity, and to kind of think about that, if anybody has any comments on that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's something I think about all the time. It's not on?
Are the microphones on?
Is this on?
Here, I think it turned. There, you just turn it on. Now this.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Okay. The thing that's interesting, I think Steve would probably agree with this, is that there barely was a field known as Jewish studies. And I'm not even sure there was a field named known as modern Jewish history when I began graduate school. One advantage was there were very many fewer books one had to read to qualify as a modern Jewish historian. There were really very, very few people in the field. The amount of research institutes, the amount of journals, conferences, and work since then has increased since then is quite extraordinary. It's just, it really is mind-boggling, and I'm sure that most of my students when I was here didn't realize that a real revolution had occurred. And the whole field has moved into closer conversation with political science, or in my case with history. And as it's done so, it's picked up the advantages and disadvantages of the last 50 years of what have been trends in those areas. So in some cases that has been, in my view, to the good, and in other cases not so always so beneficial. Because history, or I should say academic life in general, is a lot like the schmata trade. Things come and go, and what's in fashion one year is not in fashion another year. And historians are no less finicky than anybody else in the world of fashion. And they also, at times, I think historians suffer from a sense of inferiority. They don't have enough own confidence in their own profession, and they go whoring after false gods, and they try to see what's going on in some other academic field, anthropology or critical theory. It seems where they try to incorporate it. So that's one bad thing that's happened. But
One bad thing, we're doing very well.
Yes. But it is extraordinary blossoming. The last 50 years has been a revolution.
I agree totally with Todd. I'm going to actually just talk about one piece of what related to what Todd said, which is, at least in the East European field, the watershed event for our field is the opening up of Eastern Europe and of the former Soviet Union and the access to archives there. And it really is true that graduate students follow the source material. In other words, I think if the general field of modern Jewish history has exploded, the East European field has exploded even more because you have a tremendous reservoir of previously inaccessible material. That probably wasn't the case with Britain or France, but it is true for Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. So our field, our subfield, the East European field, is which was tiny. As I mentioned, I think that there was in America there was Tzvi. I always say that in America there was only Tzvi. Full time dealing with Jews of Eastern Europe and Russia and the Soviet Union. So I would just mention. It's not an answer to your question, but I want to get it off my chest.
Doesn't have to be.
I'll try to connect it to your question, but I want to mention a part of Tzvi's work in the 1970s and a little bit 80s that we often forget, and that is he was involved in real analytic work on the contemporary condition of Jews in the Soviet Union. When in the period of the refuseniks and of the Soviet Jewry movement, and whereas we had a lot of propagandists then, and some very talented Jewish propagandists, Tzvi was maybe the only voice doing analytic work, which was really important. And I'm often thinking, I don't know if Jewish studies scholars do that today. In other words, we again have a politicization of Jewish studies. We have people on the left, we have people on the right, and we know who they are. The field itself is quite politicized. But I don't think we have scholars today who try to do analytic work in their field,
Sociologists of American Jewry.
Well, the sociologists are always doing contemporary, but are you working on contemporary British Jewry? Would you think of writing analytic pieces about contemporary British Jewry? No. But Tzvi, while he's writing his book on the 1920s, and work on the Holocaust, was also writing on what's happening right now. So that's an interesting model for us to think about, using your historical knowledge to also inform your understanding of the present.
Anna?
So, and I was thinking about what Todd started with, the fashion. So, and about what students do. So, students often come and ask what I should work on, what is hot in the field. And I always tell them this with the story that I heard from Tzvi. And then Tzvi tells that story that he has this tie that's a narrow tie, and once every 20 years it goes into fashion. And that is exactly what I tell students. Just do what you like, and then eventually it will go into fashion. And thinking about Jeff's question, what are these things, what we've gone into fashion, what are interesting and all this. The Century of Ambivalence work of Tzvi just came out, but what about that study of Jewish sections of the Communist Party, which, his first book, which for the first time, I think, said that, Jews are just one of those ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union, and we should look at them into that context. And I think that really changed the way we started studying Soviet Jews. Because suddenly it was not the whole world is against us story, but this was the story of the context. And I'm thinking about all these things that come back into fashion now. For example, a few years ago, the Holocaust Museum identified the field of Holocaust in the Soviet Union as one of the priority research fields. But if we start looking at what was done in the field, what was written, the book that Jeff mentioned, Bitter Legacy, has been around for quite some time, and it made all these contributions, very important contributions to the field whenever that was published. I'm sorry, I don't remember by heart the year when it came out, but in the 90s, right? 91. As David now says, the studying of contemporary Jews, but some of the more interesting studies of today's Russian Jews come about Russian Jews who live outside of Russia, Russian-speaking Jewish diaspora, and again, Tzvi's work was central there and is with the recent book and all that. But I also want to think about, not just all exciting things that are happening, that there are changes. So one of the things that was very important, that was what we were taught by our professors, so central, is to learn Jewish languages. Without Yiddish, without Hebrew, without all these languages, you can't write Jewish history. And David also mentioned the archives, which opened and you could look. So now we have tons of archives, and we don't have to leave the room to access those archives. They're all digitized. They're all on the screen. So many of them are on the screen of our computers. And in theory, that would change the way we write history, what we think is important in all this. But what really happens, because it's so easy to actually access the documents, we don't want to do work, and our students don't want to do work. It's hard to learn Yiddish. It's hard to learn Russian. It's hard to learn Polish. Why can't we take those documents and plug them into some Google Translate? Now Siri tells me, I don't know if you have the new system, Siri can translate the language things for you. You don't have to do all this. So now with all this accessibility of all these documents, it could potentially that our advisors, people 20 years ago, 40 years ago, answering your question, were dreaming about of having on the top at their fingertips. Well, what do we do with that? And what we do with that, we write obscure histories. The Jews of Shklov now is not obscure. You know what I mean? Like now we can write a dissertation about burial practices of Jews in one particular Polish town between 1879 and 1892 in 3 years, and you will have 5,000 documents about that particular topic. How important is, how is it changing the way we write history? I think that remains to be seen. And there is something inspiring actually about listening about that potato book, which I'm going to look up soon, about scholarship being relevant for more than 10, 15 years of how long that tie is fashionable, and actually thinking of writing scholarship based on our new technology, based on our new access that will last 100 years. I think that's one of the challenges that we're all facing.
Well, you know, a book on the history of cotton won the Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago, so we haven't come that far. I'm going to give a slight answer to my own question. I'll answer it in greater detail when I introduce it to you, but there's just one thing that you said that made me think of another contribution that Zvi's made, and that's the contextualization of Jewish history and the Jewish experience that I think of. That for a long time people wrote about Jewish history, Jewish politics, Jewish culture as exceptional, and it is exceptional in some ways, but I think that Zvi's work is always contextualized in a way to show that it's not always exceptional, and that there are points at which, you know, the state of the Jews, not Israel, the state of the Jews, but at which Jewish affairs corresponds to how other minorities are treated, particularly in the Soviet Union, and there are points at which it diverges, and we need to look at both the points at which it converges and the points at which it diverges, and I think that's a point that's often left out in history writing today, or in general writing today about the Jews in general. And so I appreciate that that's something that Zvi's always maintained in his writing and has taught us to maintain in our writing as well. Let me open it up, see if there's any questions from the audience about anything that the presenters have said, either in their formal presentations or in this brief discussion that we've had. We can go for about 10, 15 minutes of discussion before we break for a little bit, and then we'll have Zvi's address. Any questions from the audience? Yes, Beryl.
I have a very short comment suggested by this conversation and our sages who wrote Rotz Kitzvi. So in this field, the motto should be rush like Zvi.
Thank you. Others?
There's somebody over there.
Yeah, Deborah.
This is a question just for Todd. I wondered, given the time that you're talking about, there was a newspaper, right? The Fortune magazine publishes regarding statistics, as it were, about Jews, and saying what fields Jews were in the U.S. And if there's any comparison that you might draw between this being taken up by just a regular business magazine in the States as compared to the efforts that were made somewhat unsuccessfully, it sounds like.
Yeah. I don't really think there is a comparison because there was little support within the Jewish community in England for this kind of work. Whereas the Fortune study to which you referred, and in general, statistical work on Jews in the United States, as you know, were well established. And there is in American Jewry is always, I shouldn't say always, but at least certainly since the end of the 19th century, has seen value in that kind of social science work and analysis. It continues to do so today. But there was skepticism in Britain, and plus, as I said, in the 1930s, when perhaps there might have been more need for it or more interest in it, they were overwhelmed by the problem of resettling refugees. And that simply took priority over everything.
Yeah.
Yes, just also a question about the social science project. Can you speculate on why these very smart social scientists didn't get to the points you were alluding to at the beginning, that these sorts of arguments were not actually likely to be successful in dissuading people from being anti-Semites? Why didn't they figure out what was really at the base of anti-Semitism, that statistical arguments were not liable to make much of a difference.
Well, interestingly, there's very little speculation about the nature of anti-Semitism, that is from the viewpoint of social scientists, until the 1930s and 1940s. And a lot of that research was done by German Jewish refugees in the United States. People associated with the Frankfurt School. And before then, there really wasn't that kind of concern. Now, you would think that communal officials and social scientists everywhere would have absorbed some of the notions about human behavior that are usually associated with Freud and his school. But they didn't. It wasn't until the late 30s and the 40s, that is the period after I'm talking about, that those began to. And plus, it takes a while for those kinds of views, I hate to use the word trickle down, but to trickle down and gain any kind of widespread assent within, let's say, Jewish communal agencies. So it's not unusual that they didn't realize that human beings are not rational. There's still many people who believe they are rational, and there's still many political creeds that are based upon this kind of I thinking. But in fact, and things didn't change. So part of the answer is I think there's a certain reluctance to face the implications of that, which are scary.
Yes.
I think there's any chance that, given the upsurge in the last 2 years of anti-Semitism.
Hang on, let me get you a microphone. Just, if I can get this out of here.
Can you hear me now if I speak a bit louder?
I'll give you this anyway.
How's this? Is there any chance that, given the upsurge of anti-Semitism in the last 2 years in Europe, Great Britain, and unfortunately the United States, that the reluctance to deal with this substantive fashion may alter? Will we have a different experience now, since it seems to be more than just Mr. Trump?
First of all, you have to be careful when you say there's been an upsurge in anti-Semitism, by what you mean. There may be louder volume in public discourse, but in terms of barriers or obstacles to Jews entering positions of prestige in any Western society, those barriers continue to fall away. So what there is much more tumult, much more yelling and shouting, some of which is due to the ease of using social media and the web. So you have to be careful about saying there is or isn't. But it should be fairly clear to more and more people, not just because of anti-Semitism, but perhaps because of the reconsideration of the election of somebody, of Trump, that perhaps politics is operating on a different level, and how do you factor that in? Now, I don't think Jewish defense agencies today, in general, in the West, assume this strict Enlightenment liberal view of what causes anti-Semitism. I think they're much more sophisticated than that. I mean, if you want to ask yourself an interesting question is, why does anti-Semitism in America decrease? And I'm talking about in terms of discrimination, social, economic, academic, professional, beginning sometime in the mid-50s to the early 60s, and continue to decline up to the day. It wasn't because the ADL was publishing more pamphlets. Okay, one has to ask what kind of deep-seated structural reasons were responsible for it. Now, it's no coincidence, and again, if we want to pick up on contextualization, this is also a period in which there's greater integration of other groups formerly excluded from the mainstream, whether it's women, whether it's African Americans, whether it's Asians, whatever. All these things are happening, and there's a relationship. But it may have nothing to do with defense efforts on the part of the groups. Maybe there were broad structural changes in the nature of the economy. So anyway, I'm saying that, but I think there's more awareness of that, okay? But there still is, at some levels, a kind of gut reaction. We've got to get the true story out. And that may not be, let me give you just one local example. For more than 10 years, a group of neo-Nazis have been picketing the synagogue to which I belong on Shabbat mornings. And they started with 10, 12 people. Now they're down to 3 or 4. What really made the difference, and they were denounced by all the clergy groups in town and city council and right-minded people, everything, didn't make any difference. The single most important difference came when someone exposed how invested these people were in neo-Nazism and began to publicize it. And then when people saw that they were not just, because there were plenty of people who would support them because they don't like what Israel was doing, but when it became out that what really was motivating these people was anti-Semitism and a hatred of blacks, of Jews, of anti-homosexual sentiment, then people began to really fall away from the group and they lost numbers. Suggesting that it wasn't just a question of correct information, but it was this kind of, really in this case, it was of a defense really being an offense, exposing them for what they were, and rather than simply trying to counter with the truth or accurate information, what they were saying about Israel.
Let me ask David actually a question about when you mentioned the opening up of archives in the former Soviet Union. I'm curious if you think that the opening of the archives has changed how we view Jewish history in the Soviet Union, or even with Russia, Jewish history of Russia, or if it's just kind of helped us, fill in the blanks, fill in the gaps. And maybe then I'll ask that same question to Anya.
I think people don't understand that, well, you do, but many people expect, are waiting for a sensation, a bombshell, and don't understand the nature of historical research, which is it's incremental, and there are shifts in understanding, there are enrichments, but no, nothing has turned on its head. There are a lot of blank areas that we never even imagined could be a topic that are now topics. Take Anya's paper, which is, after all, based on archival material in the Ukrainian State National Library. Who would have known that we could have Soviet Yiddish folk songs from World War II until she found this Bergovsky and other material. So it's not that now we view it all differently, but we definitely view it much more richly and much more fully than we even imagined.
Let me follow up for a second, because who would know also that there were rabbis in Russia who were writing polemics in favor of the Tsar? That also strikes me as surprising, but I gather that that's not from archival sources, right? You're reading. So why is it that only now are we able to uncover that? What's happened? This has been presumably been around for 100 years.
No, that's a very different order of question. That, I think, probably has to do with the fact that we all understand that orthodoxy has political power in Israel and in the Jewish world, and we become aware in the last generation that they cannot simply be dismissed or ignored as an irrelevant relic of past times, but that we do have to pay attention. So that's a way that general social conditions have shifted historiography to say, wait a minute, you can't just write them off, which is what an earlier generation would have said. Let's follow the vector of history. We all know Jewish history is leading to Zionism, or we all know that Jewish history is leading to liberalism, and the other people who don't follow those directions are the relevance. So that's how I understand not only what I do, but the rise of interest in Orthodoxy in general in Jewish historiography.
Good answer. Anna?
So I think, I don't know, like opening of the archives led to us by thinking what kind of questions we could ask. And I think a lot of things that happened, to build up on what David said, is that, well, the history was not that revised after those archives opened. Maybe it will take time. But I think one of the things that did start happening after the collapse of the Soviet Union is that Russian Jews suddenly became a lot more relevant in a lot more ways. So, for example, take the definition of what it means to be a Jew. I mean, until people started really looking into what Russian Jews are, Russian Jews means Judaism. It's only when Russian Jews came along, it's suddenly this whole discussion of, of thin identity and what it means to be a Jew in the Russian context. And that all happened long before this whole business of fluidity of Jewish identity that came into American Jewish studies. The Russian Jews were studying of Russian Jews opened that question as well. Even talking about anti-Semitism, it's such a hot and interesting topic right now in the United States. But, you cannot study Russian Jews without studying anti-Semitism. It's not possible. Russian Jews define themselves as how well they could fight off anti-Semites. That has a lot more importance to them compared to observing the laws of Judaism or even associating themselves with being part of Jewish community. That's how they define being Jewish. And I think there is something in that's interesting to study in the context of a society that starts talking seriously about anti-Semitism again. So I think it's not just the opening of the archives, it is the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also the fact that there are almost 2 million Russian-speaking Jews living outside of Russia. What was it, between 350,000 to 400,000 in the United States, about 1 million in Israel, all these other places. These people are changing the nature of Jewish experience everywhere. And I think the collapse of the Soviet Union really leads already to the whole change of the field of Jewish studies.
Okay. All right. Thank you all very much, and thank you to our panelists.